Thanks, Paul. I do. And that won't go better than the last presentation I gave online, where somebody said after 2-3 minutes, "Where are your slides?" So
we'll tell you if we can't see them.
So thank you for the thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the prompt. That should. Oh. Let me get to.
Yeah, so, we can see that.
Happy with that. Well, as I say, yeah. Thanks very much for inviting me along. And thanks also to Susan for the lead in and covering a lot of issues that I will cover in slightly different ways, and for her undiluted enthusiasm for quality assurance processes. I should say by way of background that I've actually only been with QAA just over a year. For 32 years, I was an academic in some guise or another at the University of East Anglia before I took severance to move to Cornwall, and then missed higher education. So I came back to work with the QA. So I've done lots and lots of roles around examining quality assurance, accreditation in my own discipline of the life sciences. But today I'm going to try and talk in fairly generic terms, rather than trying to second guess the issues associated with your particular discipline. So the problem, as carefully enunciated by Susan, and me using a slightly different slide from an OFS bulletin, is something of a drift up over time in the proportion of what is called good degrees or upper awards of firsts of 2-1s, and that particularly crystallized in the pandemic, when we saw a little bit of a leap in the number of firsts awarded, a little drop in 2-1s. But this had been something that had been recognised by the UK Standing Committee on Quality Assessment 2 or 3 years before, which basically saying that increased proportion of upper degrees questions the usefulness of the classification system. And again, as I think it was Susan noted with her newspaper quotes, there's a potential to undermine confidence in the integrity of standards from our institutions. So just tell you what you all know. Degrees are classified historically to final, but more in recent times aggregate marks. They're classified in 4 historic and unequal divisions, and institutions report the proportion of students in each division, and that goes into publicly available databases, which allow those kind of analyses to be done, as you saw on the first slide. What is helpful to remember is degree classifications predate modular degrees. In the old days, when some of us were undergraduates, classification based on final year synoptic exams. Not all of these apply to all institutions, just some. The outcomes would be based on prevalent marking conventions, so full use of the scale, what's that? There was a role, very precise role for external examiners in moderating individual outcomes. Some used norm reference classification. Borderline candidates were assessed, certainly in the life sciences, by viva voce examinations, and exam boards had discretion. Candidates could be moved up and down the grade. So a lot going on, but not a huge amount of transparency in all that. Now, modular degree programmes follow the framework for higher education qualifications, or the Scottish equivalent. They're made up of modules. You can have a module that covers the whole year, whole level, but usually they're broken up into smaller modules with and marks are derived from each module with multiple assessments. And that, as we've discussed, the weighted aggregate is the basis for classification, usually with the help of an algorithm, which are extraordinarily sensitive. As Paul talked about, pressing buttons in committee rooms to change overall profiles. And so little changes to marking practices at a local level, at a module level, can have big impacts on overall splits of classification. And in all of that, we've talked about external examiners. There is a changed focus. They're looking less at the individual outcomes. They're not involved in oral examinations. They're looking at learning outcomes at the level of the module, or hopefully the programme, and providing guidance to the institution as to whether standards are comparable. That wonderful line in the external examination form, are standards comparable with similar institutions? Tick the box and claim the pittance. So, as I said, this isn't a new problem. And in fact, before the baseline data used in the OFS statistics, there was a group called the Burgess Group that consulted the sector between 2004 and 2007. And that set in train a number of events. Now, the key thing about the Burgess report was it both recognised institutional autonomy and innate variation, but they expressed concern about classification methods and lack of transparency, and considered alternatives. And the concern about transparency at the time was that over-reliance on students understanding how the system worked, and all the unexplained assumptions, what we'd call now the hidden curriculum. And that work set the stage for some research published by UK SQQA in 2018 by a guy called Ray Backlund, which was the drivers of degree classifications, which then led to the statement of intent, which is published, is badged by UK SQA, is published by UUK, which I think Susan referred to earlier, and we will return to it again. So what Burgess was concerned about is a simple classification doesn't explain the richness of what graduates can get out of their university education. But at the same time, they also recognise that if they raised concerns, they can be exaggerated, and we're back to those dramatic headlines. So moving beyond Burgess to Backlund's analysis of a publicly available database, going back a little bit further than the Office for Students, looking at a lot of different universities by type in total, pre-post 92, post 2003 in the Scottish sector. He noticed the upward drift in first class awards, but he also noted that while some of that could be explained by the kind of great improvement criteria that Susan mentioned, there was also some unexplained. There was a bit of a black box there in that growth. So yes, and if you delve into that report, he does look at things like starting grades of A levels, and just a little aside, given I'm talking to a accounting profession, back in the day, So when I graduated in 1982, it was common knowledge amongst graduates that if you applied to one of the big accounting firms, they took no notice of your degree classification. They were interested in your A-level results. So it was something, sorry about that, was something that was prevalent at the time. So he looked at all of these things, and that formed the basis of a consultation that paved the way for the statement of intent, that looked at all the possible drivers that impacted on degree classifications. And we've talked about some of them already. We've talked about rounding, the way they're aggregated, the different splits between levels, what's in a borderline, and many more. And out of that came the sector's approach to putting its house in order, which was the statement of intent. And there were four key components to that. The need to stretch and challenge students with assessments, that issue of transparency. There was enabling staff to protect the value of qualifications, and also to publish institutional data. And at least in England, that's now enshrined under in the B4 condition. So that's something that is a condition of regulation in England, though not the case in the nations. And I just put on that enabling staff, and I think there is a real role for heads of department here to support their. And I know, I fully acknowledge the pressures of time and other aspects of the role, but supporting opportunities for academics to work as external examiners through schemes such as the Advanced AG scheme, supporting new existing academics and external examiners to apply institutional criteria and regulations, not nod at them, look at what they are, and support people when they want to apply those, and encourage engagement by staff and students with the quality assurance processes that you have in place. Some of them you may not regard as perfect, but they are genuinely there to help. Next slide just simply says the implementation of the statement of intent differs across the nations. We don't need to drill down into the mechanisms, but essentially those outputs are reviewed in different ways in each of the nations. And yes, we did note an impact of the pandemic on degree classification. Some of the reasons for that were well rehearsed in the chat and rehearsed here by UUK and Guild AG in response to the Office for Students. But I think it was perceived that the sector had turned a bit of a corner in 21-22, so proportion of those upper, at least first, dropped a little bit, 4% or so. But then we were challenged in different ways. And I think we're yet to see the impact of the marking and assessment boycott, where institutions had to reinstitute some pandemic era mitigations for students. And as Paul indicated just now, we are yet to see the impact of Gen AI on both assessment security and how we view different modes of assessment, and whether current modes are entirely fit for purpose. So problems, what about responses? Well, there's a number that I'd like to look at. They were drawn out by a colleague of mine at QAA, Danny Saunders, who did a very comprehensive literature review that was published about 10 months ago. And just extracting from some of Danny's work, some thoughts about how we can respond, and I appreciate that some of these are at a sector level and some of these are at an institutional level, but I think some are also at a departmental or discipline level, which may be of interest to some of you. So there's the issue of supplementary information, Burgess's lack of transparency, and what do you really learn from just a raw degree class, external examining, calibration. Susan, thanks for including that video. I have seen it before, and I thoroughly commend everybody listening to the discussion that ensues that you cut us off from. The use of subject benchmark statements, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Are there any alternatives like GPA? I think Jenny had something interesting in the chat before she had to leave. And the opportunities to explore practice within the TEF. So, supplementary information. This kind of falls into two categories that may or may not be helpful to students or employers. I suspect the first is an official academic transcript. I think most institutions provide this as a supplement to the degree. It's in line with the Bologna era recommendation of the European diploma supplement that's outlined, that gives the actual marks for each module studied. So a student can use that as the basis for their CV and show them by, look, I was really good at this, but the classification kind of shows that I was a bit rubbish at this. Think about your thinking about what somebody said about finance students choosing more mathematically orientated modules. I'm good at this, I can do your modelling, but maybe I'm not so good at comms or whatever. And a portfolio of information managed by the student that records their co-curricular and extracurricular activities. And the original intent was this would form the Higher Education Achievement Report, the HERE. This has been dabbled with by a number of institutions, but it is a bureaucratic and resource nightmare, and I don't think, and fair to say, it's not being widely adopted. So we're a little bit of way from what Burgess really wanted, was to avoid any form of summative judgment, but replacing it with some other form, what he called some other form of summative judgment, that kind of detailed narrative. But thinking about the way the sector has exploded, the number of students involved, that idea of ungrading and providing a detailed narrative for every student will fill university managers with despair. It's a but that is not to say that some progress can't be made towards that. External examining, I won't reiterate the degree standards project that Susan covered in her presentation, and Directory of Externals and CPD. But the idea also within that project of senior externals who could mentor the next generation of externals is important. Interestingly, the revised quality code published by QAA 5 years ago, and the new version is out for consultation, refers to the importance of externality rather than external examining per se. And we have seen in some institutions VCs who happily dispense with external examiners. We've got algorithms, we can get externality in other ways, and this does not seem a desirable direction of travel. And with that in mind, QAA published in 2022 a document containing some principles for external examining, which was published before I joined them, but as a previous exam board chair, I would thoroughly commend to you that really does detail the practical impacts that external examiners used well can have. But it is also important, as I said, it's important that having appointed good externals, you engage with them and take heed of their recommendations. Calibration, as Susan showed in the video, it's in essence cross-institutional moderation. It is a way of addressing any the limits of the impact of the professional development of external examiners and the limits of what they can do. There is that link to algorithms, because if you can resolve the borderline marks at the module level or the assessment level that feed into classification, then you kind of don't need to double dip. If you were absolutely sure that all your marks were robust, would you need algorithms to solve the issue of borderline candidates? And I'll leave that question open. But what, again, a bit like here, widespread adoption would require big policy shift and big buy-in from a range of stakeholders and resource. Subject benchmark statements. Nice to hear so much love for the subject benchmark statements. I'm happy to say that we are currently reviewing accounting and finance. We have had lots of applications for the accounting chair, deputy chair, less so as somebody appointed for finance, and we have extended it. So if there's anybody on the call that wants to get in touch afterwards and say, look, you know, what does it involve? I'd love to hear from you, because we are committed to reviewing the subject benchmark statements and make them as useful for disciplined communities as we can. They are what they say on the tin. They're from advisory groups drawn from the discipline for that subject community. They're not sector recognised standards in England. They're voluntary. But in the nations, they are key reference points. It's good to read them in conjunction with the framework, where you can find an articulation of degree standards. SBSs do it in a slightly different way, and there are different practices within different subject communities. All articulate threshold like pass standards, what you need to get a third, but many also cover what typical standards, which sort of covers the 2221 area, and excellent, which is a first class. So whilst they're very useful, they don't align precisely with upper awards, which may or may not be a good thing. Alternative models, yes, grade point average. Burgess Group explored these alongside an extension and contraction of the summative scale, and I'm sorry, not upgrading. I knew I'd still have a typo. Ungrading, not giving a grade at all, but just giving that narrative about the student performance. But there was a strong preference back in 2007 time for the status quo. Institutions want to keep degree classifications, and I've seen nothing to see that change. There's some modelling data out there to suggest that and it's cast as a double negative, does not foster grade inflation any more than other systems of representing summative assessment. And yeah, and I think that's for the reasons that somebody mentioned earlier, that GPA is not always pure. Sometimes it discounts some marks, some years, and there are other manipulations which mean that it can be gamed, and it's a mixed, there's been a very mixed response to it, but there has been some dual running in the UK, where students could request their GPA, but it's been limited to a few disciplines and faculties. And it was interesting to hear what was said earlier about it being preferred for postgraduate entry to a classified degree. And I don't have a view on that. It was just interesting to hear that bit of intelligence. But delving into this data is not all bad. It's not all bad because it does reveal some interesting things, that there are gaps in degree outcomes for home students, and differences between students from different ethnic backgrounds in terms of the attainment. And again, it's interesting to note that some of those changed during the pandemic era, and Susan's touched on that also earlier about, did we start explaining assessment a bit better to some? Did we make clear our expectations? And I think there is, some much more useful research to go into that. So the TEF is constructed in a way so the reporting doesn't fuel gaming or grade inflation. The view of OFS is those safeguards are already in place. But it does encourage analysis of institutional metrics to ask why there's excellence in student treatment, and it does specifically ask to interrogate whether that extends to awarding gaps, and whether you're doing something well or not so well, or whether you need to up your game. So whilst the TEF is that's not really what it's designed to do, there is some merit in exploring TEF narratives and applying them to individual disciplines. So I've noted down a few discussion points, and I'm making some assumptions in putting forward those discussion points. First of all, undergraduate degree classifications and those for integrated masters are not going to disappear soon. English providers are sensitive to the fact they may have to account for further unexplained increases in upper awards. Gen AI will inevitably force some re-evaluation of assessment. There's no head in the sand here, I'm afraid. Many responses to upward pressure on grades lie at an institutional level, whether it's algorithms, policies around average grades, policies around assessment. They're hard for those of you working at a subject or discipline level to deal with, and can be, to be perfectly honest, having been in your shoes, downright frustrating at times. And some lie within the sector, in the upper echelon, responses by UUK and other sector bodies. But discipline communities can respond through individual departments or through collective action. So some possible local responses. Please do ensure your colleagues, especially programme and module leads, are familiar with sector reference points. It can be a big help for them. And if they haven't read them recently, get people together over coffee. It's a good resource. Do encourage staff to use the full range of the marking scale and not second guess classification boundaries, which is a kind of default for trying to manage grade inflation yourself. I'm not going to give a first class mark, even though they've told me everything I could wish to know in that answer. It's really not acceptable, and it's open to challenge by students, and the student has right on their side. Instead, promote redesign of assessment and marking rubrics to stretch students. And again, I realise everybody's very busy, but that may involve some element of professional development or mentoring within your department. From my own experience, close working between a teaching director and chair of exam board can be an absolute godsend for heads, particularly if they're able to work with colleagues to implement external examiner recommendations. You can be seen to be doing the very, very best that you can. Recruit and retain good externals. push back a little bit when they say that you can only have them for 3 years. I kept people for 5 years when they were good. You shouldn't keep people forever. There should be a healthy turnover. But if you've got somebody who's good, try and get the most out of them. And please do train your staff for the role. And also, I think it would be helpful to start that conversation within your community and with your PSRBs about calibration. It may help all of us in the long run. So thank you for having me. I'm almost perfectly to the time allocated, and hopefully that will promote some questions.